Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. We are in another installation of Nehemiah this morning. Obviously, filming from a different location. Maybe you grabbed your favorite cup of coffee with me as we're diving into this passage together. As we're looking at this second part of Nehemiah in chapter 4, just to remember, we have just finished talking about they're working on the wall, they're trying to get it finished, and now they're starting to experience assaults by the enemy. And with these assaults, Nehemiah, it's amazing to see what he does here. His first response is to go to God in prayer, to seek his face, to bring these petitions to him, not to lash out, not to try to get retribution, not to try to make himself look like he's on equal footing with these other people, but simply to seek God's face. He knows that this is what God has called him to do. He wants to see it successful, and so he pursues God in the trials that they're experiencing. And as I said before, the last time that we looked at the passage, this is only the first of several assaults by the enemies. It only continues to get worse. And so this morning, we're going to look at verses 6 through verse 14. Let me read that for us. It says, So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the wall of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. In Judah it was said, The strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, They will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. At the same time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, You must return to us. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So it's an interesting scene that we see before us. But if we start in verse 6, rather than addressing his mockers directly, he speaks to God about them. And then what does Nehemiah do? He just gets right back to work. I mean, this is a man who is dedicated to what God has called him to do. This is a man who did not allow people to get him down or cause him to burn out. You know, oftentimes we face the onslaught of pressure and naysaying, and to be honest, it accumulates and it wears on people at times. Sadly, that's what causes burnout in ministry for some pastors. But here's a situation where Nehemiah, well, probably it's hurting him, it's affecting him. He's going to God when this stuff happens. And I want you to notice that this isn't about Nehemiah. This isn't about him not quitting. It's about God's people staying on task. That's the big thing here. They've now finished this wall, and the verse says that it's halfway completed. But notice the why here in verse 6. Because the people had a mind to work. They're not quitting, at least not yet. I mean, oh, that this would be true of the people in our churches. That no matter the opposition, that we don't give up. We continue to pursue. Perhaps even when things seem harder than they were before, as the situation appears to be for the Israelites here. That they're continuing to pursue what God wants for them, continuing to pursue what God's desire is for their lives, and that we would rightly do the same. But now notice in verse 7, here is wave number 2 of the enemy's attacks. You've got Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, the Ashdodites. They hear about all this stuff, and now they're not just angry like in the first few verses, now they're very angry. Emphasis here that their level of anger has just increased. So now here's wave number 2, the enemy's attacks. And for whatever selfish reason they have or motive, they are pursuing that motive as hard as they can. In fact, I would even argue just as hard as the Israelites are working, they are trying to work to the counter. They are trying to, I mean, first it's these snide remarks, right? We looked at it in verses 1 through 5. And now they're actually threatening physical violence and harm on these people. But did you notice, however, that there are more enemies now mentioned here than there were before? I mean, think about it. First, we had Sanballat and Tobiah, way back in the early part of chapter 2. Then, in the latter part of chapter 2, we add this guy named Geshem the Arab. So here we are in chapter 4, the middle of chapter 4, and now we have 5 different groups of people who are upset with Nehemiah and the Israelites. And verse 7 says that now they see the wall is being built, that it's getting completed, that breaches, broken down areas are beginning to be closed up. So essentially, they're witnessing Jerusalem becoming a more secure city than it used to be. And this puts them over the edge. They are upset. They are mad. And verse 8 makes it plain. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. So to them, they're doing the natural thing. They're going to form an alliance with one another and plot against Israel with each other. So they're so riled up about Israel's success that they're literally beginning to make plans of war against them. I mean, that makes Israel look like a pretty big threat, which begs the question, why? They want to unite as a singular foe against these people. Now, think about that for a second. Think about how ridiculous that really is. Because here is a group of people. They have lived in exile. They have been treated not well. Those who could barely fend for themselves were left behind in Jerusalem. Now Nehemiah returns, yes, with laborers, yes, with materials. They're rebuilding this wall. Do you really think that these people are just the kind of people that are going to be able to defend themselves against some massive 5-nation army? That they're so hot, so angered at Israel, that they're going above and beyond to craft an army so large to come against these people that honestly, probably one of these groups of 5 could easily overtake, just given the comparison between the two. They don't need this massive army, yet they feel that threatened by what God is doing, that they want to amass this huge force to oppose them. Almost sounds familiar today, right? When the things of God are happening, when the people of God are doing things for the Lord, it's incredible sometimes how large the opposition can feel or can seem or can physically be that vehemently oppose the things of God. And here is a real life illustration of that. But again, we've got to give Nehemiah credit, because look at verse 9. And we prayed to our God. So this is not just Nehemiah now. This is him and the people. We prayed to our God, verse 9, and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. Again, the lesson we learn here. Nehemiah's first reaction is that he goes to God in prayer during the second wave of opposition. But he doesn't just pray for things to be made right. He doesn't just pray that they'll be protected or that the project will be finished. They actually put feet to their prayers. Notice the second half of verse 9. They set a guard as protection against them. You have some people that help build the wall, and then you have other people that are handling spears or swords, shields, whatever they have for protection. They're going to try to defend themselves from this imminent threat. Now, before you think I'm putting these people on a pedestal, I understand that these are not perfect people. Look, they're struggling as well. In fact, the following verses help identify that for us. But remember, at this point, the wall is halfway done. So remember, as I said before, the task is starting to get harder. The laborers are exhausted. they're not sure they can finish what they started. And these verses that we're looking at now in verses 10 through 12, they show us that there are grumblings within the ranks. Verse 10 is going to show us that they're being compounded by these continual snide remarks from the enemies that are outside of where they live. Verse 11 will show us. But what's made it even worse is now they're receiving critical speech from other Jews that are living in the area. And that's what verse 12 is going to show us. So first, look at the grumbling from within. In verse 10, it says, in Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves, we will not be able to rebuild the wall. So the people here are disheartened. They're weak. They're worn out. They're overwhelmed. They're saying there's too much rubble. We'll never get this finished. By ourselves, we're never going to finish rebuilding the wall. There's two things that I want to say to that. First, I kind of understand where they're coming from. I've been there. I understand how they feel to some degree. Maybe you can relate as well. They're letting their circumstances get the best of them. And it's mostly because they've forgotten about the one who has called them to this task, who has promised to equip them for the work at hand. But second, when they say that they can't rebuild it on their own, they're actually right. Their focus on the Lord is slipping, which is causing this attitude and this response to their circumstances. Listen, friends, it's easy for us to get into this position where we want to serve the Lord and we're trying so hard as we can, but yet then there are other things around us that kind of overwhelm us or that get our eyes off of who God is, what God has called us to do. And friends, I just want to admonish us and say that this is something we need to be vigilant about, that we remind ourselves when these situations come up in our lives and we are feeling like this, that we focus our eyes on Christ, who gives us our strength, who has called us to these labors, who has promised not to leave us or forsake us, who equips us for every good work. But then notice the outside pressures as we're talking about from verse 11. And our enemy said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. Notice that the enemies around them, they're also not factoring God into the equation. They have no concept that God is the one who has called them to do this work and to rebuild this wall. And so if this is true, they're actually believing here that they're going to sneak up on the Israelites and kill them at some point. Do they not realize that they have been authorized by the sovereign Lord over everything to do this project? Are they really so naive to think that God is going to let them be slaughtered while working on a task that He Himself commissioned? They really have no clue. They just think that they're the big boys and they can handle the situation and they can craft the narrative to fit their agenda. They have no idea what awaits them here, as we'll find out later on in the passages. But look at the outside naysaying by their own brethren in verse 12. At that same time, the Jews who lived near us then came from all directions and said to us 10 times, get this, you must return to us. To me, the worst of the worst is these other Jews that are speaking ill of the work. They're not cheering them on. They're not saying, God's got this, you can do it, keep pressing on. No, instead, they're saying, you can't do this. Turn back now. Flee while you can before the enemies around you come down here and kill you. It's not worth it. You can't win. Let me ask you then, does that sound familiar? Have you ever heard words like this similar in your own life? Isn't it sad sometimes that the people of God sometimes work for the enemy? What I mean by that is that they lose sight of God's guiding hand. And as a result of that, because their focus is not on the Lord, they begin to speak evil about things that God calls believers to do. I think God's called me to the mission field. You're crazy. It's too difficult. Take your pick about whatever it is that a person feels led by God to do, and you hear these kinds of oppositional language. It's crazy. It's difficult. It's not glamorous enough. It's too costly. It's too time consuming. How sad it is that truly these kinds of reactions to God's will and God's plan for people's lives, that they have been heard in the halls of our places of worship. Oh, that we would heed the warning as we read these things. That as we see God has clearly called Nehemiah and these people to do this, that we would not falter like they did in verse 10 and let the circumstances overwhelm them. That we would certainly not be like those fellow brethren in verse 12. Rather than supporting them, they become part of the problem, part of the opposition to seeing this work completed. I hope we will learn the lesson as we look at that, to not be like those people. But let's wrap up the passage here in verses 13 and 14. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, they stationed the people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and rose and said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So here, on top of this prayer from verse 9, now we get to see a little bit more detail to what was said by Nehemiah. When he said at the end of verse 9 that they set a guard as protection against them day and night, verse 13 and 14 kind of fleshes that out for us to see more of the granular detail. And notice that Nehemiah places the guards with those they are familiar with and related to. Guards from each clan were stationed to guard their own family units. Now think about that. That adds some weight to their responsibility. I mean, this isn't just, hey, you go guard these people. That's your responsibility. Rather, you go guard these people that you know, that you live around, that you interact with. It makes the task more personal, doesn't it? That now they are protecting, those who are being set at guard, are protecting people that they very likely know and love. And then Nehemiah turns to these nobles and to the officials and to all the people, really. Like when an angel visits someone, very commonly that first phrase that the angel said is, don't be afraid. And here's Nehemiah saying the same thing here. He says, listen, guys, don't be afraid. More importantly, though, Nehemiah is saying, don't forget the God who brought you here. Don't forget the God who gave you the work to do, the God who promised to never leave you. He, as verse 13 and 14 says, he is great and awesome. He is fighting for you, my brothers. God is fighting for you. Don't forget that. And friends, what we can take away from this is that when we feel overwhelmed and exhausted from the assaults that we endure, please don't forget that God has not stopped fighting for you. He's not going to leave you in a desert place. He's not going to let you bear attacks without reason and without purpose. There is often a refining moment that is taking place in our lives when we endure these things. God is testing them, and he tests us as well. We talked about this in our study on Wednesday night as we looked at the latter part of Exodus 20 with Dr. Beck. It's that same kind of testing here that's going on. Nehemiah is saying, in essence, my brethren, please don't give up. God's in this. Stay in this with me. Don't let the enemy get you down. Don't let the circumstances make you feel defeated. I mean, those are some great words of encouragement that we can take to heart also. Remember, as it says in the New Testament, he who has called you is faithful. And Paul said in Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. My friends, may these words strengthen you as you prepare to gather with God's people in worship this weekend. And with that, I'll see you next time.